Do you know the unwritten rules of astronauts? Not the ones in the official manual, but the real ones. You don't? Then you're lucky. Because once you hear this story, you'll know the rules. And once you know them, you can never forget. My name is Michael House. I'm a former NASA engineer who served on International Space Station 2 until 6 months ago. Now, I'm writing this from a dim console on the first International Space Station. Outside the window, I can see Earth, a beautiful blue planet. But I'm never going home. My skin has turned gray. My veins stand out like black lines. I no longer need to breathe. I barely need food or water. And my eyes, they chill me to the bone every time I look in the mirror, have turned a glacial blue. The nails on my fingertips have grown hard and thick, capable of tearing metal with ease. The memories of who I once was are fading, but the terror remains vivid. My colleagues have undergone similar transformations. Davis talks to the wall for hours, to an unseen audience. Dr. Hubbard peels off his own skin, observing the new tissue that appears underneath. He doesn't seem to feel pain. Rather, he shows academic interest. This is a record of what happened on the first International Space Station and how I became this way. If you're considering a career in space, please listen to this story until the end. It all began 6 months ago, the moment I first saw International Space Station 2 from the shuttle. It had been my dream since childhood. Growing up in Washington, D.C., my father worked in a senator's office and my mother for a humanitarian aid NGO. My dad loved museums and took me to the Air and Space Museum many times when I was 3. He said he was sure I'd work with airplanes someday after seeing the sparkle in my eyes as I stared at the exhibits. What I remember most was when my father took me to the Kennedy Space Center for my 7th birthday. I still recall his whisper as I looked up at the Apollo 11 command module. "Michael, someday you'll go there too." That's when my dream of becoming an astronaut turned into a realistic goal. My mother was initially worried about me pursuing such a dangerous profession. But the day I received my acceptance letter from NASA, she hugged me, crying.
I'm so proud of you, Michael. But please, promise me you'll come back.
I can no longer keep that promise. At 18, I joined the Air Force, and at 24, I earned my degree in aeronautical engineering. I planned to work for Boeing or Airbus, but a letter from NASA changed everything. A request to serve on International Space Station 2. It was an opportunity I'd never even dreamed of. After 14 months, 2 weeks, and 6 days of rigorous training, I finally boarded the shuttle with 8 comrades. The moment we broke through Earth's atmosphere and headed towards the stars was an unforgettable experience. And when I first saw the space station, my new home, I was certain this was where I belonged. How foolish I was. International Space Station 2 was 4 times the size of the first, capable of housing 40 permanent staff. It had already been operational for 5 years when we arrived. Construction had begun long before the accident on the first station. The station was divided into 6 main sections: living quarters, research labs, engineering bays, communication centers, medical bay, and, most importantly, command. Each section was designed to be completely isolated in an emergency, with independent life support systems. During docking, I could see the first station from the window. Compared to the new station, it was like a tugboat next to a luxury liner. Drifting slowly in a reverse orbit, it looked somewhat sad and beautiful. I'd heard stories that crew members occasionally visited it for parts recovery, but the details were top secret. There was clearly something abnormal about the first station. Its navigation lights, which should have been blinking regularly, were flickering in an erratic pattern, like Morse code. Even veteran astronauts avoided talking about the light patterns. Even stranger, the first station's orbit kept subtly changing. A discarded station should maintain a predictable orbit. Yet, its position seemed to be adjusted week by week. Who was doing it, and why? All I knew was that an accident had occurred on the first station, killing 9 crew members. The higher-ups feared a repeat of the same accident, especially since the potential death toll on the new station would be much higher. But the deaths were a lie. The truth was far more terrifying. I first met Captain Charles Shaw in the hangar. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper military-cut hair, flanked by 2 security officers in uniform, sizing us up. He was the typical commanding officer I'd seen in the military. I later learned Captain Shaw was a 30-year veteran. He'd been a fighter pilot in the Air Force, completing numerous dangerous missions in the Gulf War. After transferring to NASA, he made a name for himself as the commander of the Mars exploration program. However, rumors said he had changed noticeably since the first station's accident. The captain announced our assignments. I was assigned to the Engineering Corps, working under Chief Engineer Roberts. 15 engineers were divided into teams of 3, each responsible for a section of the station. The first 6 months were peaceful. Days were spent repairing and maintaining, moving between artificial gravity and zero-G areas. About 60 crew members, 35 in the science team, 15 engineers, and 10 security personnel lived and worked together. The reason for 10 security personnel was to mediate intense discussions and disputes within the science team. Even brilliant scientists tended to get emotional when absorbed in their research. We engineers usually avoided such troubles, but sometimes we witnessed heated debates. One day, in the 6th month, 4 engineers, including me, were summoned to Captain Shaw's office. The captain was reading a report, seemingly deep in thought, then clasped his hands and looked at us.
"Gentlemen,"
the captain said,
"this is an extremely important mission. You will follow instructions precisely. You are to retrieve 3 large dishes from the north face of the first station. We need replacements for the communication equipment lost in this morning's debris collision. Waiting for the next shuttle would take 3 weeks."
The captain held up a finger, staring at us with sharp eyes.
"First, under no circumstances are you to enter the first station.
A second finger went up.
Second, avoid looking at the station as much as possible while you work.
A third finger joined.
Third, do not bring anything back here, whether you saw it or not. Don't talk to anyone. Leave it in the airlock and return. Understood?"
There was an unusual tension in the captain's voice. I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he gave the third instruction. What could a 30-year veteran be afraid of?
"Any questions?"
the captain asked, and a heavy silence filled the room. Clemens started to speak but was cut off by the captain's sharp gaze.
"No questions,"
he mumbled.
"Good. Departure is at 0800 hours. Be prepared."
The captain returned his gaze to his documents. It was a sign the conversation was over. We nodded, but the instructions were peculiar. What were they so afraid of us seeing in a derelict station? It was too specific for a mere precaution. Besides me, Rob, Patty, and Clemens boarded the shuttle. They were all reliable comrades. Rob was an aerospace engineer from MIT. Patty was an ex-Navy man with experience on nuclear submarines. Clemens was from the Army, an expert in battlefield impromptu repairs. As we docked with the first station and began our spacewalk, my heart pounded with excitement. Spacewalks were always amazing experiences. There was complete freedom, with nothing to worry about except the suit's performance. Removing the first dish went smoothly. While Patty worked with the torch and Rob assisted, Clemens and I moved on to the second dish. This dish, however, was near an observation window. As I worked, I couldn't help but look inside the window. Various debris floated in 0G beyond the glass. A teddy bear bounced off the window pane, and food packs slowly danced, their thin cellophane glinting. The teddy bear's black button eyes seemed to plead for help. When Clements began cutting the bolt, I held the dish to keep it from floating away, but my gaze kept returning to the window. As he began cutting the third bolt, I turned my face away to avoid hurting my eyes from the arc light, and that was the moment. A humanoid creature with gray skin and glacial blue eyes stared back at me from inside the First International Space Station. Its eyes, like the teddy bear's button eyes, were expressionless, but its gaze, which seemed to penetrate me, made me gasp. The creature was clearly human. No, it was once human. Its face barely retained human features, but its skin was thick and rough, almost metallic in texture. Most of its hair was gone, replaced by thin, metallic strands on its scalp. The most terrifying thing was its expression. It showed no pain, no fear. It was completely devoid of emotion, as if the very concept of emotion had been lost. But its eyes were alive. The remnants of a human soul seemed to be desperately pleading for help from behind those icy pupils. The creature slowly raised a hand and pressed its palm against the windowpane. Its fingers were abnormally long, and its nails gleamed like metal, as if gesturing, "Help me," I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the vacuum of space. The moment the last bolt came off, I floated into space with the dish I was holding. Driven by terror, I tried to escape and lost control. Fortunately, Clements grabbed my ankle and pulled me back.
Are you okay? Did you lose your balance?
He asked, sounding concerned. I looked at the window again, intending to tell him what I'd seen, but there was nothing there. Only floating debris danced quietly. The teddy bear, however, was gone. That creature had come for the teddy bear, and now neither was to be found. Back on the station, Security Chief Riley was waiting at the airlock. Riley was an imposing figure, nearly 2 meters tall, with the look of a nightclub bouncer. Rumor had it he was ex-Marine, personally selected by Captain Shaw. He obeyed no one but the captain, and even other department heads avoided him. He wore a smile, but his hand rested on the airlock lever, a lever that, with one push, would send us all hurtling into space.
How'd it go?
He asked Clements.
Smoothly. Recovered all 3. Back ahead of schedule.
Excellent.
He grinned, showing too many teeth.
Find anything else? Bring back any souvenirs?
Clements shook his head.
No, sir. Followed instructions.
Good.
Riley's hand remained on the lever.
Decontaminate, then return to your posts. The guys in Lab 5 will come for the dishes. Better safe than sorry.
The decontamination chamber was far more stringent than after a normal spacewalk. UV radiation, chemical sprays, and an unfamiliar blue light. Our spacesuits were molecularly cleaned, and samples were taken. The technicians inspecting our suits kept asking, "Did you notice anything unusual?" They didn't specify what abnormalities they were looking for. I tried to speak about what I saw on the first station, but Clements stopped me with a look. After decontamination, we underwent a detailed health check, blood tests, skin exams, even electroencephalograms. The doctor told us nothing about the results, but I was bothered by his expression when he looked at my test data. He looked like he had discovered something. Finally released, I saw Clements sighing deeply at the end of the corridor. I wasn't the only one who feared the lever. I tried to push what I saw out of my mind. I really did. But I kept waking up from nightmares of those icy blue eyes staring at me. I needed to know more. I had to find the truth. The station had plenty of digital media for research, but information about the first International Space Station was surprisingly scarce. The official records stated that debris from a meteor collision had hit the station directly, causing rapid decompression and killing 7 crew members. I froze when I saw the photos of the deceased. One of the Russian scientists, Yuri Doctor, a man with icy blue eyes. He looked far too healthy for someone who had experienced rapid decompression, except for his gray skin. How many others were still alive? I cautiously began investigating the former crew members of the first station, but the information I found was vague and unreliable. Still, I managed to piece together fragments. I conducted my investigation with extreme care. Direct searches would leave a record, so I accessed information circuitously through other related topics. Buried within documents on deep space exploration, new material research, and life support systems, I found scattered pieces of information about the first station. Most useful were personal notes and diaries. Scientists often kept private thoughts and concerns separate from their research logs. These were uncensored and contained raw information. One astronomer's diary mentioned abnormal communications from the first station. In the last week, the audio from communications became garbled with static. But the static wasn't mechanical. It was like a groan. He wrote. Chief Engineer Roberts knew one of the victims, Major Glenn. He was researching deep space exploration protocols. It was a top-secret project. NASA was planning manned missions beyond the solar system. One scientist in Lab 2 had heard about a new engine from Dr. Hubbard, a technology that would significantly improve space travel efficiency and transit time. However, my investigation attracted the attention of the security team. One day, I noticed that the names of the deceased had been removed from articles about the first station accident. A few days later, a notice was issued stating that interest in the old station was counterproductive to our current mission. The day after the notice, surveillance on my activities noticeably increased. Every time I accessed a computer terminal, a security guard would coincidentally pass by a few minutes later. In the mess hall, I always felt like someone was listening to my conversations. Most unsettling was the evidence that someone had searched my personal locker. The arrangement of items was subtly altered. It was a professional job, clever enough that I wouldn't normally notice, but my military experience came in handy. My colleagues also started avoiding me. Clearly, they had received orders from above. When I approached during lunch, conversations would cease. During work meetings, only the bare minimum words were exchanged. I was completely isolated. Weeks later, I was repairing a console in Lab 5 when I faced Riley again. He stood over me, tapping a wrench lightly in his palm.
I hear you've been asking questions about the old station house.
Riley was a man who didn't remember subordinates' names. Everyone was called Sports, Bud, or House, and only superiors were called Sir. Yes, I replied, feigning calm as I continued wiring the console.
Any particular reason?
The wrench tap grew a bit louder. Just curious.
Writing a book report.
The wrench hit harder than expected. Riley was testing my reaction, intimidating me with the tapping wrench, watching for any sign of distress. But I'd been through interrogation training in the military. I maintained my expression, kept my hand steady, and feigned composure.
Your search history is interesting.
Riley continued.
Deep space exploration, biological adaptation, metabolic changes. Sounds like you're trying to get a doctorate.
His voice dripped with sarcasm. Studying isn't a bad thing, is it? I replied. Inside, however, I was shaken. They were monitoring my search history. How much did they know? Why is it a problem? I was getting tired of the game.
It's a problem because Captain Shaw doesn't like people prying into the ISS accident. The captain lost many friends on that station. It doesn't feel good to have old wounds reopened.
You wouldn't want to anger the captain, would you?
His tone remained conversational, but the intent of his threat was clear in the sound of the wrench hitting flesh. I said I understood, and he left. In reality, however, I was only more convinced there was a hidden truth and more eager to discover it. That night, a note was left on my bed. Meet me in the East Passage storeroom. I have something you might be interested in. I didn't know who left it, but only my roommates or security had card key access. It could have been a trap, but Riley's intimidation should have been enough. In the end, curiosity won out. I thought I had nothing to lose. I was foolish. Waiting in the storeroom was Davis. He was a veteran engineer, older than me, and Chief Engineer Robert's right-hand man. There was a joke that he'd been there since before the first station was built, and it might have been close to the truth.
I hear you've been asking questions about the old ISS.
He whispered as he approached me.
Did you see them on the old station?
I nodded. He pressed a small notebook into my hand and headed for the door without a word. Before Davis reached the door, he listened to the sounds in the corridor. As footsteps approached, he motioned for me to be silent. We waited motionless until the security guard passed.
Read this, then dispose of it immediately.
He whispered without turning around.
Memorize it, then burn it. Leave no ashes. And forget we ever talked about this.
Just before the door closed, his final words stuck with me.
God forgive us.
As I returned to my room and began reading the notebook, I realized I wasn't insane. There were other beings on the first station, and Captain Shaw knew it. According to Davis's records, the first station was researching a meteorite containing strange bacteria. The crew was experimenting with the meteorite's metal when an accident occurred. One of the scientists, Dr. Hubbard, became infected with the bacteria. His skin turned gray, but he was healthier than before. Most surprisingly, he no longer needed to breathe. His new skin thickened, allowing him to survive in space for short periods. His food requirements also drastically decreased. It was an evolutionary change. Eventually, the bacteria were found to be infectious. All crew members became infected. The infection spread much faster than expected. From the first patient, Dr. Hubbard, the bacteria circulated through the airlock system. They had a unique property that prevented their removal by the ventilation system. Infection order. Dr. Hubbard Research Lead Engineer Chen, Assistant Major Glenn, Project Lead Dr. Yuri, Biologist, 5 others. Most tragic was when they tried to report the infection to Earth, but their communication was cut off by Captain Shaw's orders. The notebook contained parts of the infected crew's last audio logs. Return to Earth is impossible. We are no longer human, but we are still alive. Help us. NASA, specifically Captain Shaw, decided to quarantine them. The accident was a ruse to cut them off from the world. At the same time, NASA began using the infected crew as test subjects. Shaw intended to test the limits of their abilities and present them to the scientific community as pioneers of a new deep space exploration program. The experiments Captain Shaw conducted were utterly insane from a humanitarian perspective. Prolonged exposure of the infected to space to measure survival limits, testing activity in cryogenic environments, and, most cruelly, physical damage experiments to investigate changes in pain perception. The infected couldn't resist. Their altered bodies were robust, but their willpower was significantly diminished. They were like drug-controlled subjects, docilely complying with the experiments. Shaw's ultimate goal was to use this improved humanity for interstellar exploration. Beings who didn't need oxygen were resistant to cosmic rays and adapted to long-duration space travel. For him, this was the next step in human evolution. Now, they are trapped like prisoners in the first ISS. The real reason we retrieved the dishes was that the infected were trying to send distress signals to the outside. Shaw was having trouble keeping them silent. The notebook said, "Burn after reading." But how could I? This was proof of Shaw's actions. I had to hide it until I could expose the truth to the world. Weeks later, I let my guard down. There were no signs of security surveillance, and Riley didn't revisit. I thought everything was forgotten. It would have been easy to dispose of me, making it look like an accident, using the infinite void. But a worse fate awaited. It all started with Davis's disappearance. The explanation was he'd returned to Earth for family reasons, but I knew it was a lie. Davis had no family on Earth. The station was his home. Davis's personal belongings were left in his room. 30 years of space-related memorabilia, family photos, and his cherished old tool set. He wouldn't leave these behind if he were returning to Earth. Even more suspicious, no one knew the details of his departure. Normally, colleagues would see him off, but an urgent call meant no one had a chance to say goodbye. Riley's reaction when I asked told me everything.
Family emergency. Don't pry.
But Davis had no family. His wife died 10 years ago, and he had no children. He was estranged from his only living relative, his brother. That night, I fell asleep in my bed, but woke up with a hand clamped over my mouth. I struggled, but the hand held firm. My roommate seemed to have slept through my abduction. I didn't have time to understand what was happening before I was handcuffed. Riley and 2 other security guards led me like a child. As we passed through the dark corridor towards the airlock, I feared I would be ejected into space. However, Captain Shaw was waiting at the airlock, not with a triumphant expression, but rather a disappointed one.
It's a shame to lose an excellent engineer like you,
Shaw said.
but you crossed a line. You learned what you shouldn't have known, and you tried to expose a secret that should be kept.
On the captain's desk were my search history, a copy of the notebook, and an audio file that seemed to be a recording of my conversation with Davis. Everything had been monitored.
I'll give you a choice.
The captain stood up.
First, cooperate with our research on the first station. Second,
He pointed to space.
eternal silence.
I tried to resist, but the restraints held me immobile. This is a crime against humanity, I screamed.
Humanity?
The captain laughed.
You are about to witness the birth of a new humanity. This is evolution, and you, too, will be part of it.
As Riley pushed me into the small shuttle bound for the first station, I understood that my death would not be swift. Just before launch, a needle pricked my neck. The injected fluid was cold, and I felt it spread through my veins. At first, there was pain, but it soon turned into a strange tranquility. My fear faded, replaced by an odd curiosity. As the shuttle headed for the first station, my body began to change. My skin tingled, and my body temperature dropped. Yet, I felt no cold. Instead, these changes seemed natural. Most surprising was the diminishing need to breathe. I could consciously hold my breath without discomfort, as if I had switched to a new life system. Ejected into space, I gasped for a few seconds before a gray hand reached out and grabbed me. Davis pulled me into the decaying first ISS. Inside the first station, the conditions were worse than I expected. The walls were scarred with bite marks, and most of the wiring was gnawed away. Human hair and skin fragments were scattered across the floor. like a giant animal's den. Most terrifying were the humanoid shadows writhing everywhere. The former crew members wandered in forms no longer recognizable as human. When they saw me, they all turned with icy blue eyes. Davis stared at me and said,
Welcome, Michael. You're part of the family now.
His voice was mechanical and devoid of emotion, yet a deep sadness lingered in his eyes. The air inside the station was unusually cold, filled with the scent of metal. I no longer needed to breathe, but this scent was strangely appealing, a craving for metal. This was one of the symptoms of the infection. Now, I am part of the first International Space Station crew, part of the Deep Space Program. Captain Shaw's plan is steadily progressing, a deep space exploration program using improved humanity like us, beings who don't need oxygen or food and are resistant to cosmic rays. Technically, ideal astronauts. But we are only experimental animals, treated as controllable tools rather than sentient beings. And most terrifyingly, our will to resist is gradually fading. Looking at the other infected, I see my future. For the first few months, they try to retain their humanity. But eventually, resignation sets in. Emotions flatten, and they exist just to exist. Alive, but not living. I hope someone discovers this console log after we are sent beyond the solar system. I hope the truth reaches the public. I want them to know my participation was never voluntary. I'm thinking of a way to transmit this record to the second station. It might be possible by modifying the communication equipment Chen uses, but if discovered, there will be further sanctions. Still, it's worth trying. I must tell the truth while I still have some humanity left. I must stop Shaw's madness. And to prevent this tragedy from happening again in the future. If anyone is reading this record, please remember, we are not monsters. We are victims. And please, fight to ensure no one else suffers the same fate. However, it's more likely this record will be recycled along with cosmic dust. And so, my story ends. If you ever get the chance to work in space, remember the rules. First, never enter restricted areas. Second, don't try to see what you shouldn't. Third, don't bring back truths you shouldn't know. And most importantly, don't ask too many questions, like I did. But there's another rule. One I learned last. Fourth, don't think you can save them. There are horrors in space beyond human comprehension. The courage to face them is admirable, but sometimes it's also foolish. Surviving is more important. Even if you're on a mission near the first station, don't try to help. We are beyond saving. And I don't want you to join us. Finally, if you read this record and learn of Captain Shaw's plan, don't try to fight alone. Find allies, act cautiously, and prioritize survival above all else.